2 days after the trial ended, on October 27th, the Springfield Union News interviewed a few jurors that had agreed to talk to the media. They weren't supposed to say anything to the press for a week, so they kept their names anonymous. One of them said, quote, "If you saw the pictures of those 2 drowned little kids in the bathtub, or the pillow over the woman's head with 2 bullet holes like I did, you would agree with me. The guy is a goddamned animal who deserves to die." Another said, quote, "It was a gruesome case, and he's an evil man. I had never thought much about the death penalty, but in this case, we could use it." They remarked that no one on the jury had given very serious consideration to the fact that LaPlante might be innocent, and many of them were given a bad impression of LaPlante by the way he conducted himself in court. One juror said, quote, "All through the trial, he had this goddamn smile on his face, like it was a big joke. I think if he was staring at the death penalty, he wouldn't have that smirk on his face." Hi, I'm your host, Zach Williams. Welcome to Compulsion. After the trial concluded, Judge Barton released the 4 letters that had been impounded, as they could no longer affect the trial. Riley said he didn't fight for their earlier release because, quote, "it would have been a circus. This case would have become the trial of Larry Brocklebank instead of the trial of Daniel LaPlante." The first letter said, quote, "I'm more than willing to cooperate. Just tell me what you need to know. I'm worried after killing 3 people and more charges from before. I need new pen." The second one complained about the prison conditions and reiterated that he had in fact, quote, "killed 2 kids and a lady," and wanted to know if the lawyer could still help. The third one said they needed to correspond by telephone because he was worried the guards were reading his letters while he was out of his cell. Sheketoff argued that the letters had been forged because the first 3 that hadn't been removed from evidence were never referenced in the trial. He said if they were genuine, quote, "the Commonwealth would have introduced them." It does seem very convenient that in both of the letters, LaPlante explicitly confessed and didn't say very much else. With the main trial over with, the appeals could begin. And one of the first questions was whether or not LaPlante had had effective legal counsel. A few days after the trial concluded, the Boston Globe interviewed numerous lawyers to weigh in with their opinions on the matter. John McBride, who'd helped get Casey out of the trial due to a conflict of interest, said that he certainly would have made an opening statement, but other than that, there wasn't much he would have done differently. He reiterated that putting a defendant on the stand is usually a bad idea, and he absolutely would not have done that. Quote, "Most defendants don't make good witnesses, but what is worse, most defendants will allow the Commonwealth to fill in gaps in their case. One innocent slip, a failure to remember even the slightest detail, may significantly influence the jury to vote for guilty." Attorney Nancy Girder also said that she mostly would have followed the same strategy as LaPlante's defense, but she did point out that they could have pursued a bifurcated trial, which would have allowed for a trial to pursue the insanity defense if LaPlante was found guilty. After the trial ended, a few people in town actually expressed skepticism to the media. Neighbor Dolores Wilson said, quote, "When his mother and father and brothers changed their stories, that leaves questions in my mind. She also found it suspicious that police failed to find the murder weapon during their initial searches of the property." Local high schooler Gina Henry said, quote, "I don't know if he did it. How could one person do all of that?" To play devil's advocate for a moment, it is true that all of the prosecution's evidence was entirely circumstantial. Indeed, looking back from a modern standpoint, it's possible LaPlante would not have been convicted today. His defense did have a point when they said that the evidence presented pointed to someone in the house being guilty, not necessarily Daniel LaPlante himself. Perhaps one could even argue that it's possible he was innocent. And while our show is not claiming that LaPlante is innocent, There were a few things found over the course of researching these episodes that make it a possibility worth considering, even if it's very, very unlikely. The most intriguing bit of news supporting this theory is an article published on December 3rd of 1987 by the Nashua Telegraph. In this article, E. Bruce Heyman told the Nashua Telegraph that around 4:50 p.m. the night of December 1st, 1987, his hunting dogs started barking. He said, quote, "They really became jumpy all of a sudden over nothing. 10 minutes into this, around 5 p.m., he opened his blinds to look at the nearby Gustafson house, but the Christmas lights were on, and he didn't see anything amiss. The house was somewhat isolated, with the woods going very close to the back of the house. When talking with neighbors later, one family told him that their child had heard a scream as well around this time. Neighbors also all agreed that they hadn't seen a car flee the scene of the crime, so the killer must have fled on foot." Throughout this case, we have seen numerous instances of the papers covering the case getting minor details wrong, so it's possible they printed the wrong time. It's unlikely that Heyman said the wrong time, as he'd conferred with his neighbors about the incident. If this account is true, it would contradict Michael Pawlowski's statement that LaPlante got back to the house at 4:45, which also became the time that Stephen later changed his testimony to match. If Heyman's hunting dogs had been reacting to the gunshots at 4:50, LaPlante still would have had to walk or run around 3/4 of a mile back to his house, and wouldn't have gotten there until after 5, at the very least. Heyman's statement calls into question the already shaky validity of how accurate Stephen and Michael's given timeline was of the day in question. However, this wouldn't be the only time discrepancy. LaPlante's brother-in-law, Leo, said he'd seen LaPlante at his daughter's birthday at 5 p.m., while LaPlante himself said he didn't get there until 6. It could very well be an error. There's also the Boston Globe article that claims that Andrew called the police at 4:21 p.m., which would contradict all of the other accounts that say he got home at 5:20 p.m. But this article is not the only piece of evidence that could support the theory that Daniel LaPlante did not commit the crimes of which he was accused. All of the stolen items from the Gustafson home were found in Stephen's house. Even the murder weapon that was used to kill the Gustafsons was found by Stephen and Pawlowski well after the police had searched the property. Both the stolen items and the murder weapon were either in Stephen's possession or found by him. It's also worth pointing out that the clothes that were used to convict LaPlante were pointed out to police by Stephen during a search of the home, and Michael Pawlowski was the only person who testified that he'd actually seen LaPlante wearing them. Without Pawlowski and Stephen LaPlante's testimony, the case against Daniel LaPlante becomes somewhat tenuous. All of the evidence found seems rather convenient as well. The Gustafson family nameplate was ripped off the house, perhaps to be taken as a trophy, but rather than keep the plate, the killer wrapped it up in his shirt, along with the gloves, and left the evidence clearly visible on a pile of rocks. There's also the matter of the sexual assault charges being dropped. The prosecution had permission to compare LaPlante's pubic hair to the one found at the scene, but after obtaining those samples, they did not fight to pursue the rape charges. It's also odd that plenty of evidence was left at the scene to indicate sexual assault, including ripped clothes and a piece of the attacker's clothing. But the attacker had made an effort to not leave any DNA at the crime scene, ensuring that authorities would quickly be able to tell she'd been assaulted, but that there would not be too much evidence to point to the identity of the attacker. Again, it's very possible and very likely LaPlante did commit these crimes. The disorganized way in which evidence was left could just be because he was very mentally ill, and there's nothing more to it than that. But with so much circumstantial evidence, it's worth giving the possibility that he could have been innocent some brief consideration. Because had the crime happened today, a jury may have been more skeptical of his guilt. But regardless, he was found guilty. So LaPlante's later appeals would all rely on the argument that he was capable of being rehabilitated, as he'd still technically been a child when he committed the crimes. In December of 1988, LaPlante was placed into isolation to protect him from the other inmates, many of whom knew that his crime involved children. Eventually, he was moved to a prison in California. 3 years later, on December 1st, 1991, on the anniversary of the Gustafson murders, Daniel LaPlante and a fellow inmate attempted to escape from their prison in Lompoc, California. They'd cut the bars that covered a ventilation shaft and made it outside the building when they were discovered missing at Count. They were apprehended while still inside the outdoor fences. 2 years later, LaPlante would finally go to court to appeal his sentence. The appeal began on September 14th. It was to center on the clothing he'd allegedly worn being improperly seized, as the police had a warrant for a single-family dwelling, but the LaPlante family home was a duplex. His defense also argued that he should have been allowed to pursue the insanity defense, but this was struck down early when it was pointed out that the judge in charge had given the defense the option to pursue that early on, and they had declined until 2 days before the trial concluded, well after the date set by the judge. A month later, on October 4th, the Boston Herald ran an article about young offenders and said Daniel LaPlante was, quote, the kid who donned Indian war paint before killing a neighbor's pregnant wife and her 2 children. Despite the fact that they were also reporting on the appeals, the Herald was not fact-checking other columnists who wanted to write about the case. Over the course of 2 months, LaPlante's attorneys tried to put together a defense using the, quote, fruit of the poison tree argument. They tried to say that the clothing used to convict LaPlante should not have been taken in the first place, and all other subsequent evidence should not have been admitted. They said the police should not have been able to take evidence from the house, as their warrant was for a single-family dwelling. The prosecution argued that the house only had one address, and the town clerk did not know it was a 2-family dwelling. The judge also said, quote, even if sufficient indicators of multiple residency could be gleaned from the scant physical evidence available to the police, it is apparent that the defendant had sufficient access and control over the entire structure so as to warrant a finding of probable cause to search the entire building. The defense also tried to point out that even if the warrant was proper, the sweatpants, striped shirt, and wet sock were not on the warrant that police used to search the house. However, when police were searching the premise, Stephen showed up and pointed out the clothes that he claimed Daniel had been wearing that day. The judge ruled that although those clothes hadn't been posted on the warrant, quote, the judge determined that the relevance of the shirt and sweatpants became apparent at the time Stephen LaPlante identified them as being the clothes his brother was wearing the afternoon of the murder. The defense also argued that Pulaski's alibi should not have been admitted into evidence. Pulaski was at work from 7:19 a.m. to 4:38 p.m. at the Nashuba Valley Structural Company in Wakefield on the day in question. He claimed he'd been at the American Metal Processing Company from around 2:30 to around 3:30. LaPlante was challenging this because the 2-page invoice that Pulaski was supposed to have brought to his employer was missing. LaPlante was arguing that the time punch was not a solid alibi, and that this invoice should have been tracked down, as the invoice should have been there as well. It was tracked down for the 93 hearing and confirmed Pulaski's alibi. The trial concluded on November 16th, when LaPlante's sentence was upheld. LaPlante vanished from the limelight once again, until he started building a case in 2003 to try to sue the prison for not granting him, quote, unfettered access to the law library, as he was attempting to build a legal defense for himself. He was also mislabeled as a sex offender, given that he had never been charged with sexual assault. He was seeking $21 in damages, $1 for each month he had been denied access, which was the maximum allowed for a prisoner suing for deprivation of legal materials. He also wanted a guarantee of unlimited access to the law library going forward. In 2005, his lawyers won the lawsuit, and his legal team was awarded exactly $99,981. At some point during LaPlante's recruitment of them, they had inquired about any other technically illegal offenses committed by the guards, and added those to the lawsuit as well. For example, certain items being confiscated without reason, like LaPlante's shower shoes, as well as confiscating letters sent to him that contained explicit imagery or pictures. As a result, numerous papers spun the narrative that LaPlante had gotten $100,000 for suing about not being given porn in prison. On December 1st, 2007, the Lowell Sun ran a 20-year retrospective story about the case. E. Bruce Heyman, the next-door neighbor to the Gustafsons, interviewed again for this article. He told the Sun that he didn't sleep for 2 days after the murders. He said he'd been worried that whoever killed the Gustafsons may have been the same person who killed Judith Viewig in their neighborhood years earlier. Heyman's daughter, Robberly, had been the babysitter for the Gustafsons. They recalled hearing their hunting dogs bark that day, and later realizing that the dogs may have been reacting to the gunshots. Pamela Heyman had been close friends with Priscilla, and when the Sun tried to get a statement from her, she said, quote, "Leave it alone. Just leave it alone." The Sun talked to Barton as well, who maintained that had it been an option, LaPlante would have deserved the death penalty. He went so far as to say, quote, "I personally could pull the switch." Then they interviewed Andrew. He told them that shortly after the murders, he'd left his current career to specialize in working the juvenile court. He said, quote, "I felt if I could get kids on the right path, they wouldn't go on the same path LaPlante went on. And after over a decade in the juvenile court system, he left to specialize in helping churches in legal matters." In 2014, Andrew passed away from esophageal cancer. Andrew wore 2 wedding rings until the day he died. Carol still wears the wedding band from her first marriage as well. His widow said that even in his final days, he told her to make sure LaPlante was never released. Quote, "He should rot in prison." In 2015, M. Elizabeth Waters would go on to write Testify to the Light, the spiritual biography of Andy Gustafson. The book is largely about Andrew's religious journey after the death of his first family. While it does contain a lot of information about the murders, not all of the information matches up with what was found in newspaper articles at the time. In episode 1, we mentioned how the details given about the Pepperell home invasion in the book did not add up, and this makes it difficult to consider the book a 100% accurate source. It is mostly about Andrew's journey from the point of view of one of his friends, and much of the information about the murders appears to be somewhat embellished. Newspaper articles will be referenced as the source for certain conversations, but when reading the actual article, the conversations are nowhere near as detailed as in the book. In addition to this, numerous details are not correct. The book claims that Priscilla's keys were found in the woods, and that Pamela Michaela was a 16-year-old girl, when in fact she was a woman who ran her own business. In short, this book should be taken as a semi-factual spiritual memoir, and not as a primary or quotable source for information about the case. That same year, LaPlante attempted to sue the state in order to obtain certain items needed to practice his Wiccan faith, as well as extra time outdoors during certain phases of the moon. This was in the Sun, not mentioned in other papers, so it may not be 100% reliable, as they tend to be a bit sensational and opinion-based. The previously referenced Parkaman article takes this a step further and alleges that Daniel was a practicing Satanist and was suing to be able to practice his satanic rites. 2 years later, in 2017, LaPlante would again appeal his case in response to the Supreme Court decision to ban life without parole for those convicted as juveniles. This bill allows those convicted as juveniles to appeal for parole after 15 years. Because LaPlante was given 3 life sentences, though, he must serve 45 years. His lawyers tried to appeal to have those sentences run concurrently so that LaPlante could get out sooner. During his initial trial, evidence about LaPlante's troubled childhood was not brought up in court. And because 17-year-olds are tried as adults by default in Massachusetts, no consideration was given to the fact that he was still a minor. He was abused psychologically and physically by his biological father and sexually abused by his psychiatrist. He also possibly had severe untreated mental illness. Back in the 80s, these factors were not considered as relevant as they may have been today, so they needed to be evaluated for further appeals. Because of this, Dr. Fabian Saleh, a forensic psychiatrist, came in to testify for the state about Daniel LaPlante's mental health at the time of the murders and his likelihood of rehabilitation. Saleh had interviewed LaPlante during the summer of 2016. He would go on to testify for the prosecution, and it is unclear whether he was originally sent in by the prosecution or had been a third-party expert who later decided to side with them. Either way, the defense did not attempt to get another expert to testify on their behalf. During their talk, Saleh had spent 8 hours interviewing LaPlante. He recalled LaPlante shedding tears when he described the Gustafsson murders, but said, quote, "All of this was just a presentation to come across as somebody who is sad about something for which, in my opinion, he was not sad." Saleh said that LaPlante being a minor at the time had no bearing on the murders. Saleh said the murders were carried out methodically, with thought put into them, not impulsively, which would be something that youth could perhaps be more of an excuse for. Then Saleh went on to describe the murders in graphic, perhaps speculative detail, as the way he described the murders included facts never mentioned in court, and an incorrect age for Priscilla. Saleh said LaPlante had a conduct disorder, was a Satan worshiper, and tortured animals. He went on to say LaPlante currently has antisocial personality disorder, and he does not believe he feels any remorse or has been rehabilitated. The account that Saleh gave of the murders was not previously known by any of the family members. LaPlante's attorney, Ryan Schiff, said that just because LaPlante would be allowed to appeal to the parole board did not necessarily mean he would be released. Quote, "All that we ask is that he be given a chance to make his case to the parole board before he is 61 years old." He told the judge that LaPlante actually would not appeal for parole right away, as he was in the midst of completing a rehabilitation program at a treatment center in Bridgewater for sex offenders. He transferred there last year to attend the program. Schiff argued that LaPlante had shown tremendous improvement in prison. He'd taken classes, earned his GED equivalency, and became a leader in prison groups. LaPlante, as of 2017, had transferred to a minimum security prison and had not been involved in any altercations in prison in 14 years. Schiff asked the judge to reject Saleh's statements because there is not a way to objectively determine if someone's emotions are sincere. On March 22nd, LaPlante took the stand. He said, quote, "Words cannot fully capture what I have done. I murdered 3 innocent people. Because of me, a 5-year-old boy will never turn 6. There's a 7-year-old girl that will never turn 8. Because of me, a woman will never be able to give birth to her 3rd child. I robbed an unborn child of his first breath. A husband was never able again to hear from his family, 'I love you.' I do not have the words to fully express my profound sorrow, but I am truly sorry for the harm I have caused. From the very essence of who I am, from the depth of my soul, I am sorry." LaPlante faced the judge during his speech, rather than the surviving relatives of the Gustafssons, and this rubbed much of the media the wrong way, as they felt a genuine apology should have been given to those affected by it. Judge Helen Kazanjian ruled that LaPlante must serve 45 years before being eligible for parole. Quote, "The court is not persuaded that Mr. LaPlante's conduct can be attributed to any of his childhood experiences or to immaturity, irresponsibility, or recklessness. Mr. LaPlante committed 3 distinct and brutal murders. He left a family and a community devastated. The court finds that the maximum penalty is warranted." After the sentencing, Carol, Andrew's widow, spoke with the media. When asked what Andrew would think, she said, quote, "I know he and Priscilla are doing a dance. I know that he felt that justice was really served today." After LaPlante's appeal was struck down, the Sun interviewed Judge Barton, now retired, who said, quote, "He may have been 17 at the time, but out of the 150 murders I tried in my 22 years in Superior Court, it was the very worst, most horrible case I ever sat on. Thomas Riley felt the verdict was just. He said of LaPlante, quote, "He's evil. He can never be cured. He can never be rehabilitated." Riley went on to say that he was concerned about possible appeals down the line and said, quote, "He will kill again if ever released from prison." LaPlante appealed again in March of 2019. Merritt Schnipper, LaPlante's attorney, wrote that a sentence of 45 years, quote, "would not hold out the possibility, even if parole were granted, that the defendant could productively re-engage with the society from which they had been separated for nearly half a century." She was arguing that after a certain point, a long enough sentence was essentially a life without parole. She asked the courts, quote, "Is 45 years too much to serve for a juvenile homicidal defendant before you are pushing up against the functional equivalent of life without parole?" During the appeal, David Lowry gave a detailed account of the events of the Gustafson murders. He said that Daniel LaPlante, quote, "carefully planned intrusions into the Gustafson home, first breaking in on November 16, 1987, and stealing items. While he could have stopped there, he decided to return. He obtained a gun and lied to his brother's friend in order to get bullets. He practiced loading and unloading the guns. On December 1st, 1987, LaPlante broke into the Gustafson house for the second time, carrying the loaded weapon. When he heard Priscilla Gustafson and her son William entering the house, he said that his first thought was to jump out the window, but he decided not to. He confronted them with the gun, brought them to the bedroom, put William in the closet, and tied Priscilla to the bed. LaPlante said that after he tied Priscilla to the bed, his plan was to leave, but once again he decided not to. Instead, he made the decision to rape her. After raping her, he acknowledged that he could have left. Instead, he decided he would kill her. After he killed Priscilla, LaPlante made the decision to take William into the bathroom and drown him. As he was leaving, he encountered Abigail. He lured her into the bathroom and made the decision to drown her as well. After fleeing the scene, LaPlante went home, ate, and then attended his niece's birthday party as if nothing had happened. This account closely matches the one given by Soleil during the 2017 testimony, and though it was not explicitly said to have come from the 8-hour interview, LaPlante had not tried to refute anything about it during either appeal. On June 6th of 2019, the court upheld the 2017 ruling, citing the previous judge's agreement with Soleil's testimony. The presiding judge did not think LaPlante's family environment or less than ideal childhood were bad enough to warrant it factoring into her decision. LaPlante would not be eligible for parole until he'd served at least 45 years. The judge did, however, concede that he had shown signs of possibly being able to be rehabilitated in the future. Beth Williams, Priscilla's sister, disagrees. After the trial, she said, quote, "He's broken. I liken him to a rabid dog. I don't think there's anything we can do to rehabilitate him." During the victim impact statement, Beth Williams said, quote, "Abby was supposed to have her first sleepover when she was turning 8 on December 8th. Instead, she was in her coffin." She went on to speak with the media and told them, quote, "When he is 62 and applies for parole, we will be there at the hearing as long as we live, and our children will be there after, to make sure the parole board knows the damage he's done. We are still heartbroken over this." We will conclude our series about Daniel LaPlante by hearing Andrew Gustafson's thoughts on the murders, the trial, and the media's obsession with reporting and glorifying violence. The following is a letter written by Andrew Gustafson to the Boston Globe in October of 1988. The story in the news is the story of murder. The story I would have told is a story of lives lived in love, of a community of love, which was there for me in my need, of the solace I have found in my faith, of the light which shines in the darkness. Priscilla transformed and enriched my life forever. She taught me so much, how to love and express love, and her wisdom and understanding of people will always be with me. The gift of her life with me was the only inheritance she left, and the only one I could ever want or value. A former coworker of Priscilla's wrote me after the murders to tell me how Priscilla had transformed her life by the way she shared her love and faith with her. This was typical of the way Priscilla lived her life and shared her love with anyone whose life she touched. It was only natural then that our family life was full of hugs and kisses and I love yous every day. It is not surprising then how happy and loving Abby and Billy were. That Abby would be the kind of child who would be picked by her teacher to be a special friend and helper to a new child in class. That Abby and Billy would not only fight with each other as brothers and sisters do, but also would hug each other. I claim no special uniqueness over millions of other families which live lives full of love, but our stories must be told again and again and again, especially in the face of overwhelming evil. The trauma of my loss has been painful beyond comprehension, and I have enclosed some poems I wrote about 2 months after the murders, which poured out the intensity of my feelings at the time. I find now, with the trial, the intensity of the pain, the literal, gut-wrenching grief has returned. The pain of the loss is compounded at this time by the pain of how they died. I could not have survived the pain, and I could not get through this time, if it were not for the love which has and still surrounds me. This love, for me, has been the light which shines in the darkness. My friends and family made sure there was always a place to sleep, a home to eat supper at, a shoulder to cry on, a place to run away to, protection from the press, a card to say we care and we love you, a sharing of memories, and not just in the first weeks, but over all the months which have followed to this day. I felt the caring and love of my church, the local community, and the larger community of faith. One church sent a bouquet of white roses, each rose representing a family which promised to pray for me. Strangers reached out to me with cards, with books and literature they thought might be helpful, and often have been. Especially meaningful were the letters from those who also had loved ones murdered. I now know what so many others who have suffered violence, war, famine, and pestilence have known. There is no justice in this world, and life is not fair, but there is love, and in the end, it is all we have. One of the great gifts Priscilla gave me was the gift of her faith. I believe in life after death. I won't pretend to know what form it takes, but in my heart, I know that in some way, Priscilla and Abby and Billy still live. Although it cannot diminish the pain of the loss of their presence, it is a great comfort to me. I no longer fear death, because that day will once again reunite me with them. As St. Paul said, quote, "Now we see through a mirror darkly, then we shall see face to face." I have attended a support group for survivors of homicide, which has helped me get through some tough times. The pain which survivors endure is compounded by the way they are so often re-victimized. The news media do this when they sensationalize the crime and hound the survivors. When I see a reporter stick a microphone in a grieving family member's face and ask, quote, "How do you feel about?" I want to scream out. If you cared one bit about that person's feelings, you wouldn't do that to them. Misleading headlines in local papers, which have sensationalized developments in the case, have caused myself and others a lot of pain. I know many survivors feel victimized by the way police and court systems have treated them. In my case, the local and state police, as well as the district attorney's office, were all sensitive and caring to my needs. It is wrong the way the state has played a cruel game with the victims of violent crime by holding out the promise of compensation and then withholding it as part of the budget game. I am also sure that those well-meaning people who have supported furloughs for first-degree murderers would quickly change their minds if they knew the severe pain and anguish that this causes the families and friends who have forever lost their loved ones. Survivors of homicide, as well as anyone who has lost a loved one in any way, need to talk about it. I was fortunate in the way my friends and family were always there to talk about it. Many say, however, that their friends won't talk about it and even feel avoided and abandoned by them. You don't bring up the hurt of cause more by reaching out. It is always on the person's mind anyways. And to avoid someone because their pain is painful to you is to renege on your duty to love your neighbor. I feel strongly that our society is responsible for much of the violence we suffer. There is constant fixation with murder. On the news, in movies, on television shows, in literature, it infests and poisons our lives. We all share in the responsibility every time we go to a violent movie, watch a violent TV show, buy a newspaper because it headlines violence. We can't pretend it isn't real or doesn't happen, but neither do we need to be obsessed with it. When I needed to express my deepest feelings on the lives and deaths of Priscilla, Abby, and Billy, I chose the following inscriptions for the memorial stone. Quote, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." John 1:5. Love never ends. 1 Corinthians 13:8. And a life like theirs leaves a record sweet for memory to dwell upon. There is really nothing left to say. Music is provided by Hexsystem. Major sources for this episode include Parkaman.com, the Boston Herald, the Boston Globe, and the Nashua Telegraph. For a full list of our sources and links to our contributors, please see our show notes. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at CompulsionCast to stay up to date on our latest episodes and news. See you in 2 weeks.